Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News Extra, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya studios. These are our top stories. US envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner join high-stakes Gaza ceasefire talks as pressure mounts for a breakthrough. French Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu presents his plan to Macron tonight, aiming to pass a budget and ease election fears. Visa rules and Bollywood opportunities are on the table as Keir Starmer visits India to boost trade and also investment. US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and former President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, are joining high-stakes Gaza ceasefire talks in Egypt. Their arrival comes as negotiations between Israel and Hamas remain deadlocked, with key issues like Israeli withdrawal and post-war governance unresolved. Hamas says both delegations have exchanged a list of prisoners and hostages to be released if a deal is indeed agreed. To discuss this and all of today's stories, I'm joined by broadcaster and journalist Isabel Webster and deputy editor of The Spectator, Freddy Gray. Freddy and Isabel, thank you so much for joining me this evening. Let's begin with you, Freddy, and third day of indirect talks. What's the latest when it comes to these negotiations happening in Sharm el-Sheikh?
Well, the latest is that we're hearing that things are going very well, but we're not hearing much in terms of detail. And that's always a very tricky thing with these negotiations. They have to be secret, they have to be held behind closed doors, and you just pick up sort of senses of how things are going. What we understand is that the Egyptians and the Arab states are very pleased with the contributions of Steve Witkoff, who's Trump's envoy for everything, increasingly, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. I'm particularly interested in the role of Jared Kushner because I followed the first Trump administration very closely, and Kushner was everywhere. He was involved in everything from the Middle East, which he was almost in charge of, US's Middle East policy, to crime, to energy, to every aspect of the administration. Kushner sort of somehow had his fingerprints on it. And this time around, this second Trump administration, he's been mostly absent. And everybody in Washington seemed to suggest that he was still working behind the scenes, that he was very involved in sort of some of the perhaps darker financial aspects of the Trump empire. But he now seems to be emerging again as a key player in Middle East policy in particular. And I think that's probably the most interesting story of today for me.
And also, if we think about Kushner, Freddie, we think about the Abraham Accords, which is something Donald Trump definitely wants to keep alive in all of these negotiations. But Isabel, let's come to you. And what issues do remain unresolved? Because these are the questions right now. They're trying to iron out the final details of the phase one of this 20-point peace plan Trump's presented.
Yeah, I mean, there are obviously lots of questions still unanswered. I think Freddie's right. The Jared Kushner element is intriguing. Obviously, I think that's got a lot to do with the arrival of Tony Blair back on the landscape. They've worked closely for many years. Jared Kushner has described Tony Blair as being a very good friend and an important ally and advisor. And he is, of course, being named as one of the key people who would be involved in that board of peace. But those questions still remain about, what exactly a post-Gaza transition would look like. The timeline for this 20-point peace plan is unclear. Also, the timeline for the withdrawal of the troops, questions about where they would go. And there are also concerns about how you square the circle of suddenly Netanyahu being on board with, Palestinian statehood when he has repeatedly said that he's not in favor of a two-state solution. So, that remains a big question mark. But there is certainly a feeling that there is momentum, not least because for Netanyahu, who just passed this 2-year anniversary, he's facing an election next year. It might feel like the right moment for him to try and be seen in a statesman-like way, and also to try and be the one that's brought an end to all of this. And of course, we know that Trump is absolutely desperate to win that Nobel Peace Prize. Interestingly, on that, we find out in 2 days who will be chosen for that coveted prize. And I think if Trump misses out on that spot, I think a lot of the momentum actually, despite all the key players being around the table in a way we haven't actually seen before, I think a lot of that momentum is being driven, like him or loathe him, being driven by Trump and his desire for this accolade. And that is really putting pressure on the timeline. And also, I think that will also focus the minds of those who have to decide, by the way, who will win it. But we'll find out in 2 days. Those are the key stumbling blocks as I see them. But it's not to say it won't happen. And you know what, even if it's not for altruistic reasons and if it's just self-interest, if that might see an end of the bloodshed, then it's a good thing.
So it's really interesting, Freddy, that Isabel talks about the Nobel Peace Prize there and also the momentum and the pressure that is on. And that could be because Donald Trump does want to get this prize. But I've spoken to a lot of people in this region, and they seem to think the key change when it comes to this peace plan is that we've had Arab and Muslim countries extremely involved in developing this plan. And they're also putting pressure on Hamas. And really, Donald Trump wanted an end to things when Israel did launch that attack on Doha, on the Hamas delegation. And I wonder right now, is that where we are? Are we seeing the key players from the Muslim countries and the Arab countries coming to the table, and this is why the stars are aligning?
I think so. And I mean, it makes sense in diplomatic terms, to get regional players involved, because regional players are always the players in a conflict or something like that can make the most impact. As far as the Arab states are concerned, I think that it is very, very striking now that they play a part in the way Washington thinks in a way that they never did before. I mean, we used to talk a lot about the Israel lobby, which is a controversial term in America, but the influence that Israel has over American foreign policy is an ongoing subject of debate and discussion and controversy. But the sort of the real story at the moment is if you like, the Arab lobby, the influence of the UAE, the influence of Qatar, and the influence, of course, of Saudi Arabia in these very, very important discussions, and the fact that they are able to shape outcomes in a way that they weren't before. And just quickly on the Nobel Peace Prize, I think Trump obviously would like to win it, but I think what the Trump team are expecting is that they won't win it, and yet they will still be able to announce a major breakthrough in the peace negotiations. And therefore they can say, well, look at that, isn't this typical? We've just done this amazing thing, and we're not being recognized for it. Donald Trump is the great peacemaker, and he'll never be appreciated.
And it's interesting that we're talking about this right now, because obviously yesterday marked 2 years since that October the 7th attack, and we're 2 years on and the hostages still haven't been released, and we are remaining in that difficult situation, Isabel. So I think that if we have a look in Israel, they want their loved ones back, and much of the world are saying this just cannot continue.
My goodness, yeah, heartbreaking situation for the families. And I think the anniversary yesterday was a really important reminder of the anguish that they've been through. The not knowing and the worry and the heartbreak is unimaginable. But, that all plays into Netanyahu's position as well. He's been facing growing criticism from his own country. The families have long been putting pressure on him to sort that out. And dead or alive now, I think there is a certain feeling that this could soon happen, that the hostages will be sent back to Israel. So fingers crossed.
And Freddy, one thing keeps on coming up when I have conversations and in a lot of the analysis I've read, and that's the issue of trust, between Israel and Hamas. And this is where it could be dangerous when it comes to reaching a peace deal and agreeing anything, because can they trust each other to stick to it?
Well, I mean, it's the most intractable conflict on the globe, arguably. And so, no, I think trust is very low. It'll take a very long time to restore. And going back to that point about other Middle Eastern states, the sheer cost of rebuilding Gaza now is so astronomical. It's going to take a combined effort. It's going to take America. It's going to take all the other Gulf states contributing, and it's going to take even China and other countries to get involved to build it, because we're talking about a rebuilding job like nothing you've ever seen.
Thank you so much for your thoughts on that. Now, let's move on to another story. And French Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu has been asked to deliver his solutions to President Macron this evening on how to form an administration and pass a budget. Lecornu resigned on Monday after just 26 days in office, but was given 48 hours to rally support for the new government. In the last hour, he said it's not the time to change president. And that's really interesting, Isabel, because we suspected that Emmanuel Macron would definitely not want to have snap elections. So it's seemingly unlikely now.
Well, yeah, it didn't go brilliantly for him last time. He didn't manage to get a majority, did he? And he's now got this unenviable task of trying to keep the left and the right happy, which, as we know, is an incredibly difficult thing, particularly more and more in 2025. Are we going to see snap elections anytime soon? I think hopefully that's been staved off. I don't know why I'm saying hopefully. I've got no stake in this, but in terms of the chaos, I think, there is this question about the reality that the French are facing. There is this huge dilemma behind all this sort of backstory, if you like, about why there is so much chaos in government and this inability to agree a government is because there is, this huge issue of the debt that the French living beyond their means and not being willing to address that. We think that we've got a painful budget here in the UK coming at the end of next year, but their national debt's around 5% of GDP. And also the situation around pensions, and this is something that obviously Macron's become hugely unpopular for and will probably always be associated with at home. Will he, there have been sort of hints from within that he may actually back down on this after all, just in the name of sort of unity and to try and stabilise things, because where you have a weak government and you have a lack of confidence in government, there is of course always this concern around the bond markets. And if the bond markets start to go down and you see the yields go up, there are questions about whether the government will be able to repay that debt. And then that obviously has a knock-on for investment and the stock market. So it is a really serious problem. It's not just a politically embarrassing situation. It has huge implications. And I think actually the kind of sort of gridlock that we're seeing in France is actually being seen in various different forms in lots of countries at the moment. We might come on to it later on this hour, but it's not a unique problem to France, but there is perhaps a unique take on working hours and working conditions over the border.
Yes, absolutely. And Freddy, let's just talk a little bit about what Macron's options are right now. He asked Lecornu to come back for 48 hours after he resigned. It was obviously a last-ditch attempt just to try and stitch things together. But who will he be turning to now? What's next for Macron?
Well, he could try and form a coalition with the far left, but that means he won't be able to address France's deep budget problems. Or he can try, some paranoid, perhaps people who really dislike Macron in France, think that he may be trying to engineer a constitutional crisis so grave that he has to declare a new republic in France and therefore justify another term as president. That would be very, very extreme. But then Emmanuel Macron is extreme. He always pushes France to the brink of crisis, of a major political crisis. He's done it time and time again as president. He seems to think he can always win in very, very high stakes situations. And so far he hasn't really. I mean, yes, he was re-elected, impressively so. But a lot of people feel his political success has come at the complete destruction of the Fifth Republic. And it's been very, very bad for the country. He is in a difficult position, particularly on the budget. I mean, he's trying to push this through so that France doesn't collapse economically. But
and by the way,
he has not succeeded.
I do think that some of his weaknesses at home are perhaps his strengths overseas, where he has been sort of been willing to take things right to the brink and live in this sort of perma crisis. He's also been able to really put pressure on Russia, and he's been a really powerful force in Europe in uniting all of us in our sort of support for Ukraine. So there are reasons why he's in high office, I suppose, and he does deserve that credit.
I think of him a little bit sometimes, I don't know if Freddie, you agree with me, like Justin Trudeau, extremely popular on the international stage, but unpopular domestically. And this always causes that conundrum. Is his reputation in tatters at home, and will that leak through to the international stage eventually?
Well, I think so. I mean, I think the international media are always desperate for a sort of centre-left hero. When Macron was first elected, he was elected as l'anti-Trump and l'anti-Brexit, the person who was going to stand athwart the kind of populist tide, yelling stop. It just hasn't panned out that way for him, much like it didn't pan out that way for Trudeau. And in fact, the very fact that these figures are revered by the international press and on the international stage is a weakness for them, because domestically people aren't happy and they don't like these sort of figures swanning around at international events, looking like they're striding the globe while they actually make a mess of things at home.
Thank you so much for your thoughts there. Very interesting on Macron's position right now in France. But let's move on to another story. And now to the latest, all the US news. President Donald Trump is calling for the arrest of Chicago's mayor and Illinois' governor, both Democrats, as his administration prepares to send the National Guard into the city. Meanwhile, the government shutdown is causing major flight delays, with air traffic controllers working without any pay and staffing shortages crippling airports nationwide. Freddie, let's start with you. So you've just basically come back from Washington. Trump's escalating his crackdown on crime, but even calling for the mayor of Chicago to go to jail. What's happening over there?
Well, it's very, very Trumpian in that it's very much for the political audience, for the media audience. It's for making these bold declarations, saying outrageous things about mayors being locked up, sending in the Guard, which of course prompts massive cries from the Democrats that America's turning into an authoritarian state. But what I was struck by in Washington was I saw the National Guard kind of milling around. They weren't really doing anything. They were just sort of there. And it's certainly true that crime did go down, violent crime did go down in the initial phase after the deployment of the National Guard. But I think it's creeping back up. And so I think a lot of people in Washington thought it was, that their streets are just the scene for a bit of political theatre and that's it. I think Chicago is much more serious. I think the situation there is potentially very, very grave. And Chicago could turn into, it's a much more significant city than Portland in terms of the economy and its size and so on. But it could turn into something similar to Portland, which has been on fire, on and off for the last 4 or 5 years since the Black Lives Matter protests, and arguably before, actually. So, yes, I think you are seeing these angry eruptions in cities across America. It's crime, it's a hatred of Trump, it's a desire to cause civil strife. And Trump's reaction is to feed into the story for the story. Some people doubt that he's actually going to help fix things.
Freddie, can I ask you, because it really strikes me as quite stark with this story. We talk about America as being the divided democracy, but it really does feel like Trump is only president for one half of the country. I mean, can you imagine another leader calling one of their major cities a hellhole? I mean, it's in his own country. He is president of Chicago as well, but because it's Democrat, he doesn't seem to feel worried about saying something like that, talking down one of his cities. How much does that hurt people of Chicago to hear it described as that, do you think?
Well, I think Trump will be gambling on the fact that Chicago is not about to vote Republican anytime soon. But if you look at a city like New York, that's a very interesting one. Trump is obviously a New Yorker himself. And he's very concerned about New York, and he's particularly concerned about something that is very likely to happen on the 3rd of November, and that is the election of Zoran Mamdani, who is, by American standards, a very radical socialist. And that is huge news in New York, the most economically powerful city in America. And if that happens, you will see Trump's message coming into clash with the radical left. And for him politically, for the rest of the country, he doesn't want to see it because New York's very important to him. But for the rest of the country, that's going to alarm them. They're not going to want to see mayors being elected in cities who want rent controls and by left-wing standards, by American standards, very, very left-wing policies coming into force.
And he also wants free transport for everyone. There's so much things that Mamdani is calling for that the Republican administration are just not keen on at all. But when I watch some of the footage, and Isabel just reminded me of something, you know, he called Chicago a hellhole. He says cities are on fire. He's used such extreme language. It's almost like they're going to war. I don't know what you both think of that, but is it just political theatre once again, or is it this bad?
Well, I was kind of wondering if he was going to rename the National Guard. You know, we've heard that the Defense Department being renamed the War Department. Maybe the National Guard are going to be called something a bit more sort of Trumpian as well. Although, you know, they need a bit of a tougher sounding name, because I think we can all agree from some of the pictures we've seen today, they don't look that threatening or menacing. Most of them look as though they've got that sort of trademark American weight issue that we all hear about so much. A lot of them didn't look too fit at all. I don't know what you think.
I would agree with that. And Freddie, I don't know if you do too, but I had a look at them and I was like, oh, they're not in peak condition like Pete Hegseth was calling for when he did that massive speech and called all of the big US generals from around the world to attend. I'm not sure what you think, but is it time that they get in peak condition?
Well, I think it's fair enough to expect soldiers to be in good physical condition. And I think one of my take on that speech that Hegseth gave, where he summoned all of America's top military brass, and in front of Trump berated them for being out of shape and their soldiers for being out of shape, was that it stems from the 250th birthday of the American Army parade through Washington. Now, when that happened, again, you had the kind of the left-wing media in America, or liberal left media in America, saying, oh, this is an authoritarian thing, this is what North Korea does, and so on. And then you had the march, and it didn't look very authoritarian at all. You had sort of quite a lot of overweight soldiers. You had them unable to march very effectively or very convincingly. And I think Trump and Hegseth, probably that's in the back of their minds when they're talking to the generals, because it was supposed to be this great display of the American army, and it didn't look like you see in the marches with, Xi Jinping, marching before Xi Jinping, the Chinese People's Republic Army. It's a different thing. I realize that marching is not the same as war, but it does suggest an army that's not quite in tip-top condition.
Very good points there. But Isabel, I just want to go to another thing. So we spoke about gridlock in France a little bit earlier, and you mentioned this to me backstage, but you've got the common theme of gridlock. And if we think about, we're 1 week into this government shutdown, there's gridlock too in this respect in the US. How's this impacting things?
Yeah, more gridlock around budget disagreements, and the left and the right unable to come to a conclusion, to the detriment ultimately of society. Lots of, federal staff have been furloughed. Other people are working but not being paid. And it's not just legislative gridlock, but we are now seeing impacts on things like air traffic control, reports of delays at various airports from Vegas to Nashville, Houston, I think, and Newark, reporting problems today. But all of this just feeds into, the kind of narrative of this gridlock of chaos, which, you could argue Trump sort of trades on. This is, he actually stands to benefit from this. I would argue that actually, disrupting business, making flights difficult for people, ultimately has a bad impact on the economy and can cost America millions. But Freddie might have a different take on that.
No, I mean, I don't. I think omnicrisis, permacrisis, whatever word you want to do, that is the defining feature of our time. And what's interesting about it is that the crisis never seems to lead to total collapse yet. It's just been we lurch from crisis to crisis in most Western developed countries without ever really sinking into absolute catastrophe. So, I mean, perhaps we can expect that in the coming weeks. It certainly feels like it at times. But I'd say the last 20 years of Western politics, since the 2008 crash, have been one of just endless crises.
And what's really interesting is if we talk about economic crisis in the US, I just had a look at the US markets today, and despite all of this happening, they're actually positive, and they have been on a really good run of late. We see gold very high. Some people are arguing that's because of the crisis happening economically in the Western nations. But my big question to you, Freddy, and I don't know, Isabel, if you also have a point on this, but who actually has the upper hand in this shutdown? Is it the Republicans? Can they just sit and wait it out like Trump did when we had the longest shutdown in his first term? Or is something going to have to move?
Well, it's a very high stakes game, and Trump loves high stakes political games. So I think as far as he and his inner circle are concerned, they're winning on this. I mean, you might remember the video that Trump put out at the end of last week, which was a sort of ridiculous music video, AI-generated music video, which was all about Russ Vought, the Office of Budget Secretary. That's not his title. Secretary of Office and Budget Responsibility. He was portrayed as the Grim Reaper. And Trump was there playing the tonk, 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 and J.D. Vance was on the drums. And what they were saying with that is we will start just scything away at the departments that we think are part of the Washington blob and that aren't working. And so it taps in rather neatly to their agenda. And because Americans, well, they're not necessarily all that enthusiastic about Trump, at least not a majority, they really don't like Washington, and they really don't like Congress. They think Congress is where all the obstacles happen, which they think Congress steals their money. And through the Washington blob, through these kind of endless institutions, federal government departments with masses of staff, masses of costs that don't actually achieve anything. And so I think Trump's slashing message, we saw it with Doge. Yeah. Doge was quite popular with the American public at first, at least. The Americans, I think at the moment, the Democrats are looking like they're getting in the way of a Trumpian revolution that a lot of Americans support, at least in terms of cutting back Washington waste.
I do think my only real sort of observation, all of this, looking at it from the outside, it ties in with the point about the National Guard being overweight and what might people in China and the Far East make of the sort of military over in the West. And it's the same with this kind of political gridlock. And, you can draw parallels if you want to say, democracy is eating itself literally, perhaps in some cases. But, this idea that actually no one's able to pass any legislation, sluggish growth, whatever it might be, they'll be licking their lips and looking for economic advantage. And, there are these axes that we're seeing developing, whether or not that's with Russia or North Korea. And it has to be taken seriously. I think America is risking, navel gazing a bit too much and forgetting the bigger picture sometimes.
Very good point.
We need some democratic Ozempic, is what you're saying.
So you can't see your navel.
You can't see it.
And then we'll definitely have a slimmed down workforce too, if we have it anyway. Yeah, all done. Let's move on to another story now. Thank you so much for your thoughts on that. And UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer says there will be no relaxation of visa rules for India as he begins a 2-day visit to strengthen trade and also cultural ties. He is leading a delegation to Mumbai to promote investment following the new UK-India trade deal. Isabel, how significant is this trip for Keir Starmer? He's taken this massive delegation. What does it mean for him?
Would you remember when he first came into power, there was lots of criticism that he was always overseas during that difficult first 100 days and the Omni crisis, Omni shambles here. And it was all upset about Taylor Swift tickets or whatever else. I mean, his suits and Specsavers. He was abroad the whole time. And I think he's playing a bit of a Macron here, if you like, trying to look strong on the international stage to shy away from his serious domestic problems, just over a year into his premiership. And here we are. He is hugely unpopular and talk of already, possible leadership challenges. Be that as it may, he wants to tout this, huge trade deal that he's done with India, which does stand to, according to the government, produce something like 3,000 jobs and millions of pounds into our economy. And, as we've discussed this evening, there are issues around growth in this country. He won that election, by the way, pledging not to increase taxes on working people and not to cut any of the services. And yet, that was on the premise that he would build growth. He's been unable to do it. It has proved elusive for him, as most people predicted anyway. And as a result, he's going after growth. So this is really important for him. He needs to look good on the international stage. He needs to try and get some investment into the country. That might happen. But there's also, of course, the other defining issue of his premiership, and that is immigration. And, he has huge pressure at home to bring down net migration. We've seen a large increase in Indians coming to this country post-Brexit. And obviously, they're trying to get a lid on that. And big changes last week being announced at Labour conference in terms of settlement criteria, making it harder for people to stay in this country. So he's made that point very clearly and trying to walk this line between trying to draw in their money and their brightest and their best without increasing his headache at home.
Yeah, Freddy, and that is a good point, because I just wonder, if we think about it, we know Keir Starmer was not a Brexit voter, but all of a sudden he's benefiting from these trade deals with the US and now with India, and we could possibly argue that's because of Brexit, and it's easier to do than it is to do with the European Union.
Well, I mean, certainly Brexit, a lot of people don't like Brexit, but I think one of the great advantages of it is this ability to be nimble in terms of trade, to strike up trade deals with countries without the European bloc, which is famously slow to strike any agreements. And what was funny was that the Tory party, having been the party that ended up owning Brexit, were not really able to make significant progress. And Keir Starmer, while everything else about his administration has been a disaster, I don't think that's an exaggeration to say. The two things that have gone well is this deal with India that could bring in significant investment, and the deal with a potential trade deal with America, which is also very good news. And it's interesting that Trump is sort of bullying India at the moment on trade, pressuring them to stop working with Russia, stop selling Russian oil, threatening to do a deal with Pakistan, to kind of ramp up pressure on India. And it's actually creating quite a lot of tension between America and India. And Britain is in quite a good place diplomatically, because we are sort of in between, but friendly to both. So I think that is going quite well for Keir Starmer. And I do think that is a Brexit benefit.
Yeah, I would probably argue that America is an unreliable partner. You can talk about a possible trade deal with the United States, but as we know, Trump does blow with the wind, hot and cold on things. And, at the moment, the tariff situation is favourable to the UK. We've rolled out this unprecedented second state visit to try and keep him sweet. But what happens? Another third state visit, if that, it is an unreliable partner in America, which we've never really experienced, certainly not in recent history in our special relationship. And again, you can ask people whether they think efficacy or efficiency in speed and nimble, fast trade deal is actually better than hard cash. At the end of the day, Europe was our biggest trading partner. The impact on our GDP has been far more significant than any deal that with India has been able to replace at this point. So I think, if you were to judge it on the facts today, I think that's a hard argument to make, but that's not to say that those Brexit freedoms won't produce more in the future. But at the moment, I think it's a bit of a hard sell.
Well, we have to wait and see whether, the Labour reset with Europe will work, I think. But, if you think about it in terms of which parts of the world are growing, it's China, it's India, it's the United States is still performing phenomenally. economically, or at least it has over the last 5-10 years. Britain is better off being able to deal with those. Europe's overall picture is one of stagnation and decline.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we were talking about France was just one of the countries that is struggling in the Eurozone at the moment. But Freddy, you did say there that Keir Starmer has been a disaster as Prime Minister, and I think the polls will reflect that. I just wanted to give you that reassurance there. But just another thing, when we talk about Keir Starmer over in India and in Mumbai, we've seen him, sign these deals with Bollywood, so we're going to get Bollywood films coming out of London, which is good for the culture of the country. It's good for the arts, because the UK has lost a lot of investment in that, Isabel.
Yeah, that's true. And, we do already have a large Indian settled population, of course, because it used to be part of one of our colonies. And so there is that long history. And I think, Bollywood would be incredibly well received here in the UK if we were to get more film investment. There is also the thorny issue for Starmer diplomatically whilst he's on this trip with Narendra Modi, whether or not he's going to bring up the issue of India buying Russian oil. And I understand that the Indian PM had just made a call to wish President Putin happy birthday shortly before Keir Starmer arrived, which is a scenario most people in the West find quite hard to get their head around, given the situation in Ukraine. But yeah, I mean, there are, interesting sort of pulls and tensions, I suppose, with all of these major nations when it comes to trading partners and human rights and all the rest of it.
So, Freddy and Isabel, I just want to bring you some breaking news. We're hearing from Donald Trump, and he says he may be going to the Middle East by the end of the week. So Donald Trump speaking there. We're, of course, talking about this Israel-Hamas 20-point peace plan. So there we are, Donald Trump saying he's going to head possibly to the Middle East by the end of this week. What do you think of it, Freddy?
Well, as discussed, what happens on Friday? The Nobel Peace Prize is announced. And so perhaps Donald Trump is thinking he will be there on Friday. He'll be in the Middle East. He will have some what he regards as very good news. We'll see whether it is very good news to announce. And I don't think he'd be going out there if he didn't think there was a substantial chance of announcing some kind of peace deal. And if the Nobel Peace Prize, as I said earlier, if it's given to someone else after he's there having brokered this peace, you'll hear a lot of Trump saying, what have I got to do? Or people around Trump will say, what has he got to do? He's just done this miraculous deal. Why won't the world recognize him?
And
I think there are lots of key players heading in this direction. Marco Rubio, according to an Arabiya correspondent, is heading to Paris later in the week to talk about what a transitional Gaza would look like as well. So, there will be lots of his key members in the area. But I should caution, Trump thought he was going to make progress with Putin based on their relationship within 24 hours. He may be very hopeful, but the Nobel Peace Prize has a long and independent decision-making process, which one hopes is above the pressures of even President Trump. Not to say I don't think he should get it, but I just think, he may wish all he likes, but at the end of the day, there are bigger players, I would argue, when it comes to making that decision. But yeah, let's see what happens on Friday.
Yes, and he has once again said we are very close to a deal. We have heard that before as he keeps pressure and momentum in these peace talks that are happening. But thank you so much for your thoughts on that breaking news. And finally, Isabel and Freddy have come up with a couple of quirky stories of the day. So they've been doing their homework. And Freddy, yours is all about Gen Z, TikTok and forks. Okay, tell us more. Yeah.
Well, this is about TikTok, which I don't know anything about, but it is about puddings, which I know a fair bit about. And I am very pleased to see that people are using forks to eat puddings. And this is a TikTok trend where you film yourself eating puddings or desserts with a fork, which I think is fine. I mean, obviously, if it's very drippy and so on, then it's probably a bad idea. You need a spoon. But there's nothing wrong with eating a cake with fork. There's nothing wrong with eating other puddings with a fork. And I think of all the TikTok trends, I disapprove of a lot of them, like some of the more ridiculous dancing ones you see. But I don't mind this. Although I don't really like watching people eat on video, so I changed my mind slightly. But I think this trend seems quite funny, and I like it.
Will you go to the park and join in the fork trend, do you think?
If someone gives me some pudding, yeah, I'll take my fork to the park.
Well, he might say fork off, but I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that on air. That was a funny joke, but he's teed up my Anne finally perfectly, because I think what he's demonstrated there, was his very British, sort of almost Hugh Granty demeanour, which, we've worked together for many years, Freddie. So when I saw this story, I had to pick it because it's about those sort of foppish characters that, the good guys in all the movies, whether it's Billy Crystal or Hugh Grant in 4 Weddings and a Funeral. Turns out, actually, unfortunately, for the likes of Freddy, that the nice guys actually finish last. This is a new study that has looked into personality traits, and apparently if you are very easygoing and amenable as a woman, you have great success in a relationship, but if you are a bit too easygoing and amenable as a man, then you are more likely to be single. And some other interesting changes in personality based on gender. If a woman's extroverted or introverted, it makes no difference. She'll be fine. But if a chap is a little bit shy, he has lower success rates. And when it comes to neuroticism, guys who are neurotic don't seem to do very well in relationships, whereas it doesn't matter to the guys if girls are neurotic or not, which is good news for me, because I worry enough for me and my husband. And I actually do think it's quite unattractive when men are racked with anxiety. But anyway, good guys come last, Freddie. Sorry about that.
Sorry,
You're making me feel anxious, Isabel. Just this. But no, I think I'm very flattered that you think I'm a nice guy. I actually, when I heard about the story, I thought I must be winning, because I'm really a deeply unpleasant person. So it's quitting for me.
But just a quick one. Do you like neurotic women, Freddie? Because I think, is that what they say, Isabel? Apparently they do well in relationships.
Yeah.
I like women, and so therefore I like neurotic women.
But I must just agree.
Yeah. He sounds more and more like Hugh Grant by the minute.
Yeah, absolutely. The Hugh Grant or W News Extra, I never thought I would have the opportunity, Freddie Gray. So great to have such a kind person on. But just a quick thought, what Isabel was saying was so true. There's nothing more unattractive than an anxious man. Women worry enough. We just need to be told it's okay. So all the stereotypes have basically been answered in that survey. So thanks to today's guest, broadcaster and journalist Isabel Webster, and deputy editor of The Spectator and nice guy, Freddy Gray. And that's all from us on W News Extra. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Of course, follow us on X. G&T will be coming up next. Goodbye, and thank you so much for joining us.